Hi folks, I'm recording our last lecture of the semester, fittingly on the book of Revelation, the last book in the Christian Bible, and I'm doing it outside because it's a beautiful day, and we should all try and get some fresh air in these strange times. So this week we're covering Revelation, the Apocalypse, John's Apocalypse. It's a little bit of a misnomer to call it the apocalypse because there are a lot of apocalypses in Jewish antiquity, and this is just one of many. So you're looking at chapter 30 of your textbook by Bart Ehrman, the chapter on Revelation, and a couple of other Christian apocalypses are covered in the textbook. And the method, like the scholarly method or lens that Ehrman is showcasing for this particular chapter, is simply the historical method, or the historical critical method, historical criticism. In other words, he's approaching the text as a historian. So he cares about its context. And so let's situate our book that we're talking about within the New Testament by looking at this slide that has recurred throughout the term with all the books of the New Testament in the order in which they appear, and you see that Revelation is placed last. It wasn't written last, but it was placed last, probably for a reason. We talk about genre, or like the style of a text, like a Facebook status is different from a grocery list, is different from a haiku, is different from a love letter, is different from a sonnet, is different from a romance novel. These are genres, and when you're reading the very first example of a genre, it might seem fresh and new to you, or strange, or you might not know exactly how to interact with it. But when you're reading like the 50th example of a genre, then you start to see patterns and you start to know more how you're meant to interact with that genre. For example, if you saw your very first limerick and you had never seen one before or heard of one, you might think, oh, this is a funny little poem and it has a very cute rhyme scheme. And it's a poem talking about a lady. There once was a lady from Bath. And you might think that was really interesting. But after you saw your 100th limerick, you would recognize, a lot of them start with, there once was a someone from somewhere. And so then you would know the pattern of a limerick. So you would be able to better tell when someone is subverting the pattern or when someone is following the pattern. And it's the same way with the book of Revelation, maybe more than any other genre of book in the New Testament. For most people in the world, the vast majority of human beings in this world, if they read one apocalypse, it's going to be Revelation. And for most people, that's the only one they ever read. And so what do they think when they read it? They think it's really strange, it's confusing, it's violent, and it's sort of like a prediction, they think. And if they're a certain type of kind of more recent, modern, maybe fundamentalist Christian, they think it's about them. But for people who know that there are lots and lots of these apocalypses, they read Revelation and they see, oh yeah, I know what this is doing. This is this type of book. There are a lot of these. These are popular. Here's where this one is participating in the tropes and where it's following the typical pattern. And here's where it's deviating from the pattern as other apocalypses do. So what Ehrman has done in this chapter, and what I'd like to do in this lecture, is to make sure that you are aware of what it means for an author to write within the apocalypse genre, and what are some clues as to how to interpret an ancient Jewish or early Christian apocalypse. The New Testament has Gospels, it has Acts, it has letters, and it has an apocalypse. Key note, this book is called Revelation, like there's one of them. It is not called Revelations, and that is a particular annoyance for biblical scholars. When people call the book Revelations, I guess they're thinking about the letters of Paul, like Philippians, Colossians, Romans, but this isn't one of those. This is the Revelation. The book is called The Apocalypse, or Revelation. So, for bonus points, with biblical scholars, never put an S on the name. Yes, there's only one full apocalypse that made it into the New Testament. These are its various names, but as I said before, there are lots and lots of these. Here is a list of some examples if you want to read other apocalypses to get a feel for them. There's a bit of the book of Daniel that's an apocalypse. There's 1st Enoch, 2nd Baruch, 4 Ezra. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are apocalypses. There's little mini apocalypses inside Mark's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel. There's a little bit of apocalyptic writing in the letters of Paul, 1 Corinthians 15. There's the Apocalypse of John, and there are a couple of books that your textbook explores a bit more. And one of them is the Shepherd of Hermas, and one of them is the Apocalypse of Peter, and those are early Christian apocalypses. Apocalypses are a Jewish invention before Christianity existed, before the time of Jesus. They're an early Jewish literary invention, but as the first Christians were also often Jews, and since the boundaries between Christianity and Judaism are blurred for the first couple of centuries, there are also some early Christian apocalypses, and one of them made it into the Christian Bible. If you want to read these, you can just go online to earlyjewishwritings.com or earlychristianwritings.com, which are great websites that have loads of primary texts, ancient primary texts in translation. So there are two different words that are mentioned in your textbook and that I'm going to use here. One of them is an apocalypse, and one of them is apocalypticism. So the apocalypse is the end of the world, but an apocalypse in terms of literature is a genre. An apocalypse is a literary example that falls within a certain pattern of writing. It's a type of book. Apocalypticism is the worldview that's behind the writers of books like this. Apocalypticism is a collection of assumptions and beliefs that resulted in some people who have apocalyptic beliefs actually writing apocalyptic literature. So some strands of Second Temple Judaism held an apocalyptic worldview and wrote apocalypses. John the Baptist, Paul, Jesus, they were all this type of Jew. Remember when I got you to read Q, which was just like a pared down list of just Jesus quotes, just Jesus sayings, without the kind of trimmings of narrative and travels and explanations. It was just the quotes that are considered by many scholars to be a very early authentic layer of Jesus sayings material. And I got you to reflect on what would you think Jesus was like if you only had this list of quotes? And many of you said, he's cranky, he's a bit angry, he's upset. That flags up to us that Jesus was an apocalyptic thinker. He was imagining an urgent end of the world and was imagining that things were quite black and white, divided into good and evil, and that evil was going to be punished and good was going to prevail forever, and this was going to happen very soon. And Paul thinks that way too. Paul, Jesus, and John the Baptist didn't, as far as we know, write any apocalypses. That doesn't mean they weren't apocalyptic thinkers. So what is this worldview, this apocalyptic worldview of Jewish antiquity? Dualism is one important part of it. The whole cosmos is dualistic and can be divided quite easily into evil or good, light, shadow or light, devil or angel, life or death, the path of life, the path of death. And time is very linear. It's teleological. It's heading toward a telos. Sorry if my cat is going to start screeching. There's the present age, which is evil, and then there's the very next age, which also happens to be the last age, which is good prevailing. And this linear time, this historical unfolding of human history, or cosmic history, is totally in the control of God. So this is part of the apocalyptic worldview. God is in control, even if it's an evil age, that's temporary, and ultimately God will prevail. When that happens, there will be a cataclysm. It will be the day of the Lord. It will entail a judgment that will not be pretty. And that day, for apocalyptic thinkers, is like tomorrow. It's imminent. It's urgent. It's very soon. So that was the apocalyptic worldview. But what about the apocalyptic genre? How do you look at an ancient book and say, oh, looks like this is an apocalypse? Well, the first thing you see is that it's a vision of the end of time filled with symbols, symbolic. There's sometimes the use of something called a false future tense, which is, it's written in the future tense, like this is going to happen and that is going to happen, but it's describing things that have actually already happened. So it's sort of pretending to be ancient. And this vision, these symbols, have been given by a deity, often via a messenger, an angel, to a human, a special human. So the human is gifted somehow, the human is a prophet, the human has had a mystical experience, and a heavenly being has spoken directly to them. And then the language of apocalypses is cryptic. It's often some kind of code. There are numbers used to hint at other things. There are many levels of meanings. It's multivalent. It's dualistic, just like the apocalyptic worldview. And there are lots of first-person narratives, like I was in the spirit and I went up and I saw da-da-da, and the angel said to me. And there are strong truth claims, sometimes accompanied by curses and blessings, like if you listen to this, you will be blessed. If you disobey this, you will be cursed. If you join this side, you'll be cursed. If you join that side, you'll be blessed. These are mediated revelations of heavenly events that affect human history. Sometimes they're pseudepigraphical, so sometimes they're written in the name of someone from the distant past. Sometimes not. Sometimes they just kind of say who wrote them, or don't mention who wrote them. And they're often set a little bit in the past or a long ways in the past with using a false future. So that they will prophesy things that have actually already happened in order to give an interpretation of those things that will bring people comfort, because they're usually written in a context of injustice, whether actual injustice or perceived injustice. They're usually written by a group that sees itself as an outsider group, not by a group in power. Some people think they're written as a cathartic means of comfort, saying like, we are not in a good position right now, but almost like it's a revenge fantasy, but someday those evil people in power are going to get it and our God will prevail. So yeah, that's what, if you open up an apocalypse, these are many of the elements that you're going to see. And according to your textbook, there's sort of, these things are, they're not like limericks where it's really obvious to see the pattern and they all more or less follow it. It's difficult to categorize them perfectly and say, well, they all have these 10 things. So the things I mentioned are a blob of things that apocalyptic writers could draw from. But according to your textbook author, there are sort of two main paradigms for writing these. One of them is the heavenly journey. An angelic messenger communicates to a prophet and sort of brings the prophet along on a journey through a different realm, basically a heavenly journey to see the truth about events and then relate them to people on earth in the normal realm. The other type is sort of a timeline, a schema of coming events. Like there's this stage of history, and then there's going to be this leader, and then there's this stage, and everything's kind of divided in order. And Ehrman calls these historical sketches. So Revelation has elements of both of these, both the heavenly journey and visions, and the timeline, the earthly historical timeline. One thing that's interesting that we don't know enough about, but I'm interested in, is something called Merkabah mysticism, or chariot mysticism, which seems to have been a part of some Second Temple Jewish ways of thinking. And we think that this existed because we see a trope recurring of prophetic kinds of visionary mystical texts describing going up in a chariot, like being brought in a magical chariot into the sky to see things, or being in the spirit, or being taken up. These phrases that recur: I was in the spirit and I saw, 7 mountains on fire, or I was taken up and I saw a monster with 12 heads, that kind of thing. So scholars suspect that behind apocalyptic writings and the apocalyptic worldview is a form of mysticism, ancient Jewish mysticism. And we see that in Revelation as well. So why did people write texts like this? Your textbook says they were evidently written in times of distress and suffering, whether real or perceived. So why would you write a text inside your community in a time of intense suffering? One of the hypotheses is that these were written for comfort, because it was thought that the idea that it's all part of the plan, even these terrible times are part of the plan, and God is ultimately in control. If only we could see the big picture, we would see that it was all orchestrated. The good will win. And so that was meant to be a comforting thought. It's all under control. So the purpose is to comfort those who are fearful, those who are suffering under oppression, those who are afflicted. But perhaps it was also to afflict those who are comfortable and force them to take a side, take the side of the oppressed, protect them, join them. That's a hypothesis. So when you're interpreting an apocalyptic text, power dynamics are very important. The meaning of the text changes with the social power of the interpreter. So it means something very different when an oppressed minority calls for violence that is very unlikely to ever happen, than when someone with power calls for violence. One is a cry for justice, but the other can cause bullying, oppression, or even death. So when a stratum of society, such as some groups of early Christians who were also Jewish, who were not very palatable to Romans who were in power, not totally palatable to non-Jesus following Jews. When that type of group, even in times when, the Roman Empire would ask questions later and kill first. Any group of, 50 people get together to make a fireman club, and they could just as easily be killed in the Roman Empire. It was quite brutal in order to maintain the peace. So when you're in that situation and you write a text that says, one day all of the mighty people will be pulled down and they will burn and the good will rise up, it's a cry for justice. But when, for example, the President of the United States of America, which is a dominant nation, would interpret this text as having it in the place of the people in the book of Revelation, for example, being oppressed, that is a reversal of the situation in which the text was written. And when someone in power calls for violence, it can actually cause violence. When someone in power calls for hatred, it can actually cause hatred. And so context is everything. So that's why Ehrman chose to use the historical method for this chapter of the textbook, to show that the context in which this book was written has a major impact on its meaning. And in a new context, it can mean very differently. So this business of apocalypse is talking about the end of time. We remember when we talked about the Gospels, when we talked about Paul, there, in the earliest layer of Jesus' followers, there was definitely an idea that the end of time was very near. Jesus was going around talking about the Basileia, the empire, the kingdom of God, and said it was coming, but it was also already started. And then 20 years later, Jesus was killed, executed by the Romans. 20 years later, Paul was still carrying on a message that the end was very, very soon. And it was started. It was started and it was soon. Later New Testament writings, this isn't everyone's cup of tea. Across the New Testament, which is a quite diverse collection of worldviews and texts, we can see some authors that kind of continue to support these eschatological hopes, looking forward to an end of time. Although they're starting to maybe think it's not so soon, starting to say, well, we don't know when it's going to happen. But then other early Christian authors kind of just quietly dropped the talk about the end of time and began to focus more on how to live given more time. So what was the context of the book of Revelation? When was it written? Well, some people, with a lot of these books we aren't sure, but with Revelation, many people point to the coded numbers as a way to tell who is being referred to. And there are these numbers mentioned in the text that relate to a certain really bad individual. And in Hebrew, numbers also have a letter value. And the number 666, which is mentioned in the book of Revelation as an anti-Christ, corresponds to the name Nero. So around the 60s. So parts of the book of Revelation may have been written very early, around that clash between Jews and Rome in the 60s, late 50s, 60s, and culminating in the destruction of the temple at 70. But I think we can say that most scholars settle on a consensus-ish that it was near the end of the first century, like say around 95, that the book came into a form more like the way we have it now. So it was sort of edited and finished around 95 during the reign of Domitian, who was quite a persecutor of any suspicious groups. Some of the earliest manuscripts of Revelation don't have 666, they have 616, which also actually spells Nero, depending if it's Nero or Neron. So yes, that's a very strong indicator that the book sees probably Nero, but perhaps most Roman emperors, or like all early Roman emperors, as the big enemy. I pulled out the quote from your textbook where he explains a bit more about the numbers, which is something that people always ask me about. So he says, intriguingly, when the name Kaiser Nero is spelled in Hebrew letters, Nero becomes Neron, and their numerical total is 666. More intriguingly, the name can be spelled in another way without a final N at the end. The N is worth 50 in the Hebrew numerical system, so when the alternative spelling is employed, the name adds up to 616. But then Ehrman goes on to explain how understanding the genre of an apocalypse, how reading all of the ancient apocalypses helps curb the tendency for people today to read this book as being about them. That is not how apocalypses work. Apocalypses are a coded language for something happening at the time, something for which the author feels he or she could get in trouble, be persecuted, be killed for, and so they refer to the powers that be using codes. But the hearers can parse the codes and understand, like, we know this is about the emperor. But maybe if the emperor were to get his hands on a copy of the text, he would not know that, hey, this is about me. They're saying bad things about me. So that's what Ehrman's getting at in this quote. He says, the author of Revelation is not referring to Hitler or Mussolini or Saddam Hussein or anyone else in modern times. His enemy was Rome and its Caesars. It was Rome that had dominated the other nations of earth, exploited their native populations, oppressed the people of God. It was the Roman emperor who was worshipped as divine and who persecuted early Christians and sometimes put them to death. This book is about how God is going to overthrow this emperor and his empire at the end of time, which was supposed to be really soon. That's page 541 of your textbook. So, what's the message in the book? What's the upshot? If you can wade past the codes and the symbolism and the kind of circular structure that is not linear, even though it's talking about time as linear, it's kind of circling around and around. What is the message of this book? Especially if I asked you to kind of read it for this week, but if it's too much, you don't have to read the whole thing. I just want you to read enough to get a feel for it, and I'll tell you the crib notes of the message of the book. 1, the God of Israel is in control of world events. 2, very soon a time will come when that God will take power away from evil empires, take away suffering and pain, bless the entire world, all the nations, through Israel, become permanently available to humanity. No more ups and downs of evil ages and just ages. It would be like an endless just age, which would come after a time of terrible judgment with violent repercussions for those. Everyone falls into two groups, those who fall into the wrong group, violent eternal end. And for Christian apocalypses, this judge is Jesus. The Jesus in the apocalypse looks quite different from the Jesus in the Gospels. If we only had Revelation, we would not picture a gentle, kind of funny Galilean Jewish peasant wearing sandals and healing people and having like flocks of people coming to him to listen to teaching stories and to be healed from sicknesses. If we only had Revelation to look at, it would be something like the Jesus in this slide. A machine of judgment and violent havoc and a terror. That is the Jesus of the apocalypse. Not a Galilean human being, but a cosmic, violent force. Not relatable, sympathetic, conversational, like we would find in the Gospels. Not the kind of mystical, spiritual Christ of Paul, but a cosmic judge with no mercy, who brings violent, permanent judgment. So, compared with the rest of the New Testament, apocalypses are quite different, and they fell out of fashion, but they were still going on at this time. Compared with the rest of the New Testament, Revelation presents Christ as a political and religious leader sent straight from God to end the present order and to violently inaugurate the permanent reign of God. In Revelation, Christ is not Jesus of Galilee, Jesus of Nazareth, but a God, more or less interchangeable with Israel's God, and most importantly, Christus Pantocrator, Almighty Judge. So it's quite a book, and a lot of you have said, like, I don't want to read it, it gives me nightmares. Some of you have said, no, I love it, it's my favorite, it's so weird. But according to Oxenmeyer, in the book Introducing the New Testament, the most common interpretive error in reading the symbolism of Revelation is to confuse the symbols of the book with its message. The symbols are not the message. They carry and embody the message. And that all comes back to genre. You've got to understand apocalypses in their historical context before you can read this book. Otherwise, you run the risk of making the book about you, which is not the way apocalypses work. They're very time-based. But if you can, like Oxenmeyer says, extract the specific symbols, like that Nero was bad, or Domitian was bad, or it was bad to live at the time of Domitian, but that God is in charge and justice is coming, or even that justice is something to be desired, suffering is something not to be desired, living in peace with other nations is something to be desired, being oppressed or oppressing is something not to be desired. If you can extract the bigger meaning from the time-based symbols, then you kind of get what all the apocalypses are about. On the other hand, it's a book that kind of does come with a warning, because it ends, like many apocalypses, it contains curse and blessing. So it actually ends with a curse and blessing formula. It says, I testify to everyone who hears the words of this book's prophecy. If anyone should add to them, God will add to him the calamities that have been written about in this book. And if anyone takes away from the prophecy of this book, God will take away that person's share from the tree of life and from the holy city that are written about in this book. So this is a way for an author to say to future copyists, don't you take liberties with this vision. You keep it exactly as it is, or you risk getting in big trouble. Not my trouble, divine trouble. But what happens when much later, hundreds of years later, early Christians decide we need a list, like an official list. There's too many books going around, they're all different, we need to decide on a list. And they do decide on a couple of lists and solidify it into one. And they place this book last. And this book ends with a curse. And then when the Bible gets published as one book, what does it mean that it ends with this curse? For some, this curse retrojects over the entire, all the way back to Genesis. So you've got to think about that, what this curse meant to the author when he wrote it, and what it can come to mean if you think about it as applying to the entire Bible, and whether or not that latter meaning is an accurate historical way to read an apocalypse. We have come to the last week of class in this crazy time of coronavirus, where we used to meet in person and suddenly now this is how I teach you on YouTube. Congratulations, you made it. This is your last week of new content. Here's what we need to do for this week of content. Number 1, you need to read chapter 30 of your textbook. You need to read enough of the book of Revelation to get a feel for it, but you don't have to read the whole thing. You need to watch this video and have a look at the bonus video that's on Moodle that is a lecture by a New Testament professor about this chapter in the textbook, but I made this lecture before I listened to his lecture, so it's really interesting to see how two different New Testament professors come to some very similar conclusions and also do things quite differently. So have a look at that lecture. And then, lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the assessment period. I'm not going to disappear now just because the new content has finished. I'm still having my office hours. I'm still only an email away, and I'm still going to be uploading new content in the revision section of Moodle. So I have a set of slides that are kind of a nutshell look at each book that we've covered, and I'll be adding different things to really help you get ready for the take-home exam. Let me tell you one thing about the take-home exam. We went over our exam, kind of the format of it in class one day, but that was before all of this happened, and so the format has changed now, because I can't just ask you, list all the books of the New Testament in canonical order, because you can just look them up. It's open book. And so I've had to take away the questions that are very fact-based, and I've had to change it to questions where you have to reflect and synthesize, more like essay questions. So how do you best prepare for that? Do all the readings, listen to all the lectures, look through all the slides. I mean, including the primary text readings and the textbook readings. And then when you see the question on the take-home exam, you don't have to have it memorized, but you'll have an idea of what you've been through, and you'll know kind of where to look. You have a whole week to do your take-home exam, because it's 5 business days, but you got a weekend in there too. So you've got a whole week, but I designed the exam to take like a day. So don't agonize over it. Do take as much time as you want, but just remember, I'm not grading it on as though like it's a coursework essay. It's still an exam. So in short, do not stress about it. Everything is going to be fine, but start now revising so that it'll not feel like a panic. It'll feel like, oh yes, I'll reread this chapter for that essay question. Okay? All right. Thanks, everyone.